the big challenge that a lot of sports have now is that they're trying to attract children into a very traditional sport model. So it is, I think we're at a moment in time in this generation where we'll see sports have to change. You kind of have to lead people through almost the journey to making an impact, because it's undoubtedly harder than it's ever been to compete for attention. But if you want to have big impact, you have to gently introduce like entertainment values and fun, and by the way, sport.
When you get the attention or that online engagement, are you seeing a disconnect between getting them physically active, or, are the efforts effectively translating into that increased participation?
I think that is the $64 million question. And people always, when I speak to a sports organization, they always say,
Before we start, thank you for all the DMs and great feedback on Kuul Conversations, which I love to hear, so keep it coming. And what would help us even more is if you choose to subscribe. It helps me to bring you more amazing guests and cool conversations. Now let's dive into the episode.
Stu, great to have you on Kuul Conversations, and I'm very excited for this conversation in and around your experience and over a decade of success leading growth across Britain's biggest digital and social properties. You've had senior roles in sports, children's, news, and you've expertly delivered content from everyone from like young kids to parents, teenagers, young adults. And so I'm curious, what inspired you to step away from that high profile corporate world and launch Lucky Socks Media?
Well, I mean, thank you for the kind words, first of all. It's quite scary when you say it like that. I think for me, it's the challenge of trying to, there's obviously doing your own thing, but my expertise has kind of grown almost by accident. I think over the last 10 or 15 years, I spent a lot of time leading the BBC Sport website, and we launched the social media team during the 2010s, and just that huge growth of like mobile and social media that frankly we all lived through. I always say I kind of became a digital and social expert by accident. And then I obviously spent a lot of time with CBeebies and CBBC. And the thing that I found working there, apart from the fact that it was the most fun I'd ever had at work, is just almost the purity and the excitement of working with that youngest audience. So as you said, I've worked in BBC News, I've done BBC Sport, I've kind of led, if you like, older, more old-fashioned TV newsrooms. Okay. But working in and around the children's space is absolutely brilliant. And just trying to, you can kind of see where you make an actual difference to people's lives. And that was one of the big things that I took from being at CBeebies and CBBC, where, we were doing things around trying to get kids involved in like Blue Peter badges or whatever it might be. But it felt like you were actually making a real difference to, life. And you think about your own childhood, you can remember all of the theme tunes to all of the shows. And, those formative years are really exciting parts of an exciting thing to be a part of. So that's kind of where Lucky Socks came from, really, bringing the world of sport together and bringing the world of, sort of getting more children involved. And hopefully just sort of getting more children active as part of what we do.
I can absolutely resonate with that in working in the children's space and seeing the difference. And perhaps at that young age, it's easier to see some of the differences that you make almost in the short term, like even sometimes immediately. And it's hugely rewarding. And now, like, Lucky Socks Media is working with some of the biggest names in sports, Chelsea, UK Sports, UEFA, helping them to grow their impact with kids. So what does that look like?
Well, it can be a range of things. And you mentioned some of the clubs there. So sort of Chelsea were one of our first clients a couple of years back. And then I've done some ongoing work with like UEFA. And it's a range of different things, really. You kind of have to lead people through almost the journey to making an impact, because it's undoubtedly harder than it's ever been to compete for attention. And we see that right across the sports industries. Everybody are just struggling to find children and then hold their attention when they do find them and everything else. So it's kind of a journey in that sense. But a lot of our work can be anything from like project-based stuff where we're almost translating what children want Where are they? What do they do? What's the kind of language you can use? Because I think one of the beauties of the children's audience is that I see a lot of people go, oh, we just need to reach children and young people. But 3 to 5 year olds are very different to 9 to 12 year olds, and their needs from experiential stuff through to like content, the psychological need states that they have from content, totally different. And again, a lot of that comes from their own abilities and their own development. So that's a lot of the work that we do is often it starts right at the beginning of going almost this is who children are, and we will be working with fairly senior executives in sport who it might be quite a while since they had children in their lives because they're so far up the corporate ladder that generally they're of a certain age that they're detached from it almost. So there's a lot of sort of explaining, translating, helping them understand, and then kind of working out what the art of the possible is. Because you see a lot of people going, oh yeah, we know how to do kids, but that whole world and what I've really learned at CBBS and CBBC is the languages, the early years foundations stuff, all of those bits that contribute to like a preschool strategy or a Generation Alpha 6 to 12 strategy, whatever it might be. It's so different.
You've covered a lot there. When you work with the sports organizations and we think of maybe the Gen Alphas
Yeah.
that you've mentioned there, what are you seeing that's different to this audience compared to maybe some of the other audiences and even to that age group, of previous generations
Yeah.
when we're talking about speaking that Gen Alpha language?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because what you see a lot of is people automatically think they need to dumb down to speak to kids. They just do. They just and let's face it, some of the slang of a 10-year-old is as nonsensical now as the slang from when I was a 10-year-old. So the whole skibbity toilet and all that sort of stuff that 10, 11-year-olds come out with. It's a nonsense and largely, but it's contextual for them and it's their world. By the same token, is that 16 and 17-year-olds, they're not saying skibbity toilet or anything like that. So every generation has their own language. The hardest thing you can try and do is almost dad dance, if you like, that sort of dad at the disco sort of stuff where people go, oh, we'll try and inject ourselves to have that voice and it doesn't work. And one of the things I always say to people is if you are trying to reach a younger audience, whether or not it's 11 to 15-year-olds, whether or not it's 6 to 9-year-olds, it's not a case of dumbing down. It's just doing things with more clarity and frankly, more simply. So best example of this is Newsround. Okay. So Newsround absolutely still intrinsically holds the values of the BBC. Everybody looks at Newsround, the oldest running news product for children in the world. It's been around since about 1972, 73. But it still has the BBC values at heart. So it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you're England Rugby or British Cycling or UEFA or whoever. You can still talk to children and keep your values without dumbing down. And I think that's a real key thing that we kind of spend a lot of time talking to people is because everybody just thinks that doing children's stuff just means dumbing down and being silly, and it doesn't.
What kinds of content have you found to be most effective in turning passive fans, into active?
One of the things we often see, and I must have said this in several boardrooms now in sport, is that whether or not it's rugby or cycling or cricket or whatever, is the people who work in those sports, and this is a former athlete yourself, you're in that sport because, frankly, you bloody love that sport. You live and breathe that sport. It's your entire life. And that can be the starting point for people to get children into their sport. They kind of go, we really love rugby and we want to inject our passion for rugby straight into a child. And it doesn't work like that. Actually, it's sequential. We've actually come up with a model called the Lucky Socks model, which is like sequential of how organizations can walk through that kind of journey to becoming a fan or being inspired enough to play and everything else. And with children, it all starts with fun. It's as simple as that. And I know that with the work you do at Kuul Play, it's not about being the greatest at any one sport. It's just about enjoyment. You know, it's
Absolutely.
sport and being active is playing TIG in the playground. You know, TIG's not in the Olympics, but it's a great game. Okay,
Absolutely.
and that's one of the things that we kind of have to almost lead people to is look, first and foremost, if you want a child's attention, you have to make their faces move. You know, you've got to make them smile. You've got to make them laugh, because if you do that, that's your first step towards winning. And if they're enjoying it, just like the work you do at court, if they're enjoying that, then maybe they do the next thing. And then maybe they do the next thing. And then maybe they, but what you can't do is go, everybody come here and get really serious about this sport. I mean, you can with some, right? Because they might already be interested in sport and everything else. But if you want to have big impact, you have to gently introduce like entertainment values and fun. And I kind of think everything has to be flipped on its head. It's like fun and entertainment first, and by the way, sport. Starting point of everything is having fun.
How difficult is that when you speak to the boardrooms that you're in? Often, these big sporting organizations that may have youth divisions have adult divisions, and it can be easy to be framed in the competitive side and the adult version and how to appeal to the adult audiences, maybe as an adult. And as you said, people in the boardrooms maybe not close to kids in general or have young kids. How have you managed to present this philosophy and flipping it in its head?
I would just by exactly almost having that conversation and going, look,
Yeah.
nobody starts as an elite player. And I guess what you tend to see with a lot of sports organizations is they're measured on their own success. So they're measured not just on participation, but if you think about, the Olympics and everything else, countries are also measured on the amount of medals they win. So there's a real, that elite pathway is a real
Yes.
challenge, and it kind of hangs over lots of people. But growing participation and having fun in a sport starts up here. And the bigger this funnel is, the more success you get down here. Whereas actually, if you speak to that many people, the funnel is tiny and narrow, and it's pointless. So I think the message is getting through. I'm certainly see it in the work that I do now. More and more people are going, we know we have an issue here. We're not really sure what to do about it, but we know we have an issue. If you look at what cricket have done with the 100, they've gone, we just need a whole new format. And frankly, we've got a great sport. Cricket's a great sport, but in its traditional format, it's not massively appealing to Gen Alphas or families. But that's exactly what they've changed now. They've gone, let's just make it entertaining and fun. Let's pipe in music. Let's have DJs and all the rest of it and make it entertaining. It doesn't always have to end up with what the sport has been for the last 100 years. Maybe it's a new form of the sport, but for me, it doesn't matter, because you'll have children being more active and participating in sport.
And that's the critical part, isn't it? If we're looking at the sports stats, I know Youth Sports Trust brought out data there at the end of last year, 30%, barely getting 30 minutes of activity in a day. And you have this declining participation, and you're speaking to, we need a new model and a new way of engaging sport. And it might not look the same as before. In fact, it almost invariably shouldn't, because we have a different generation, we have different needs and wants. And so we have declining participation, and almost like this new generation that's drifting away from sport. That's, a national and global concern. And like, from your experience, particularly coming from the entertainment background, what do you think is going wrong here?
It's a whole myriad of societal issues, I guess. And if you think about it, in a world where we are now becoming so polarized about everything, politics, technology access, wealth, everything, that is a huge societal issue across the developed world, frankly. Um, I guess the paradox is the fact that this thing, as much as it's a pain in the bum, because the average age for getting your own mobile phone in the UK now is about 9, similar across Western Europe. We see the social media penetration is absolutely enormous as well, and that clearly brings all sorts of terrible things with it. But what I think it does offer us the opportunity to do is it gives you access. It gives if you want to do it in a responsible way and in a way that can be used for good, it potentially gives you direct access to engage.
Okay.
So that's the first step. and that's the weird thing is that I think I often think that mobile phones and social media are as equally good as they are equally bad, or equally bad as they are equally good, and they can be terrible, but they can also help you start to develop that relationship, which then might lead on to being active or being involved in a thing, because it's access to communities, it's access to your friends, it's access to information and entertainment. Um, Now, I don't want to sound Pollyanna about that, right? Because there are loads of terrible sides of mobile phones and everything else. Um, but it's a huge societal issue of how do we just get children to move more.
Yeah.
Um, and I think only by really big organisations, whether they're sports organisations or those sort of, similarly in schools or government or whatever it might be, um, really take it seriously, then that polarisation might just continue.
Yeah.
That's a kind of a terrifying thought, but also feels like a bit of an inevitability as well. You know.
It is a huge challenge because there's the digital and physical element. We can't deny the fact that kids have screens and they will be on
Yeah.
screens, but there's the digital safety element and there's the how long are they on screens. And what role do digital interactions like gaming and online sports content play in keeping kids engaged with the physical aspect of sports? And that if we're looking at the sports stats,
Mm.
I know Youth Sports Trust brought out data there at the end of last year, because fundamentally you're engaging through digital, but then you want to see the participation grow. I mean, is that the goal?
I think it's absolutely the goal, and what you see a lot of is where sports organisations are now. The majority of them are still in the competition for time. They're trying to work out just how they access this generation.
Right.
Um, I always kind of minded to think that even though now I think it's magnified because of things like the mobile phone and social media, it's kind of always been an issue that's probably been coming through my whole life. So I am now almost 47 for my sins. And I remember in the 80s, there used to be a TV program which was called Why Don't You? And the whole premise of that kids' TV program was, why don't you turn off the TV and go and do something else instead? And I kind of feel like every generation thinks that the current generation are not as active as the one that came before. And that's probably been true since the war because, the growth of TV, the growth of when I was a kid, the Commodore 64, and then, games consoles.
Yeah.
Um, so I think this is just almost like an evolution of what will just naturally happen. The big challenge is how do you just compete for their time and get them engaged with you and then hopefully push them on. And the reality is that it will probably never be as big an audience as it used to be because now there are, I don't know, a million niches and we can all go and have our own niche and we can go and do the thing that we really like. Whereas, back in the day, we had 4 or 5 TV channels, so you couldn't find your own niche. Now, if we had that available to us, we would have done the same thing.
Mm.
So I don't think this problem's going away. I think me and you will be talking. You're younger than me. I think you'll be talking about it until the end of your career.
Mm.
But that doesn't mean to say that you stop or that you give in.
Yeah, yeah. And when we're talking about the idea of okay, engaging them, that's a hurdle in of itself, just digitally engaging them to get their attention, to attract that for sports, to attract them
Mhm.
to sports, because there's so many other options for them to engage with. When you get the attention or that online engagement, are you seeing a disconnect between getting them physically active, or are the efforts effectively translating into that increased participation?
I think that is the $64 million question, and people always, when I speak to a sports organisation, they always say, can you give me the direct evidence of where just reaching a big audience leads to more participation? And generally, you kind of can't. But what it's a bit like anything, right? It's marketing. It comes back to what people used to do back in the day. You shout loud enough people hear you, and some other people taking the message. I think what you can do now is what you couldn't do years ago, and what you can certainly do now with digital interactions is you can at least see if they're engaging with it in a digital space.
Okay.
So at least that is measurable, so you can see whether or not they're positive to how many, you build communities, then taking that leap of going, and now we want you to do something. You know, it is just hard, I guess. And
Mhm.
I think it's like anything. The more people you are able to connect with, the bigger your chance of getting children to participate in sport or just be more active.
And do you think that we're headed maybe towards a future where kids may be more likely to watch the sports through the online engagement rather than play them to that physical aspect?
Yeah, maybe because I think what we see now, especially from not Gen Alpha, but if we, and I hate using those kind of
Mm,
those names, but if you look at 16 to 24s now,
okay.
I think that age group is far more aware of physical and mental well-being than when I was in that age group, which is far too long ago. Um, but actually, it's not as much about team sport now; it's about being fit and active.
Yeah.
Whereas back in the day, if you were fit and active, it was generally because you were playing a team sport. Nobody in the early '90s was going to the gym really, or just all the rest of it. Um, and I think that's kind of where we end up in a way is that maybe it isn't all about team sports, or it's not about sport, but people are more aware of being active.
That's and broadening that definition of sport towards movement and play.
Absolutely.
And do you think that like sports organizations maybe are on the traditional models of sport? Do you think they are more focused in engaging these younger audiences, especially we'll say Gen Alpha, Gen Zs? Are they interested in it as fans or as participants? Or lifelong fans, or are they developing future athletes? Where does their interest lie when they're working with you, for the younger kids, the youths?
Largely, I think at that age, it's just about awareness and getting
Okay.
them engaged in their sport. And I think the big challenge that a lot of sports have now is that they're trying to attract children into a very traditional sport model. So, sports that have existed for 100 years, 200 years, however long, at the same time is that all kind of new sports are emerging and, just arriving on the scene, whether it's a sport or a type of, you know, um, just a type of physical activity. I guess you look at the rise of paddle and stuff like that, which
Yeah.
bit easy to play, is a little bit slower. And then you have some sports that, as facilities have kind of dropped off over the years, become more and more exclusive. So it is. I think we're at a moment in time in this generation where we'll see sports have to change. Again, the 100 is a prime example. And I remember having this conversation probably the best part of 10 years ago when I was at BBC Sport and we first started covering esports
Right.
through BBC Three. And we were having quite a philosophical conversation about sport and how it changed. And we were talking about, do people think, like kids now will watch other people play games online?
Right.
Well, for them, that's not that different from going to a stadium in 1920 and watching a game of football. You're not
Mhm.
participating in the sport,
Right.
when all you're doing is watching it,
Right.
and you're a fan, and that's okay. And I think that we're kind of seeing that almost like evolution of what sport is, what sport means. My 10-year-old stepson plays Fortnite. He would play it all day long if we let him, but he's on there with his friends. So for him, that's social gaming. Now,
Yeah.
we both know we'd much rather he was kicking a football about in the park or running around or doing whatever. But for him, that's a totally social experience, and I know that because I can hear all the weird noises that he's making with his friends. Um, so the sport is in such a moment of evolution of what it means. It doesn't, just because we've always played a sport in a certain way,
Right.
doesn't mean to say that that's what it has to be like in the future.
Love it. Love it. And it's true in the sense that we can't, deny the value of esports in terms of the social aspect. And
Mm.
maybe in some ways it's competition to traditional models of sport in the sense that it does need to evolve and grow, and we can do better because sport has the power. We know the power of sport to change, to bring people together. There's a social element to sport. There's the health benefit. There's so many good things. And maybe this generation coming through and it is really asking more of us to design the experience that is much broader, and that comes with a digital element. So if sports are looking at it, there needs to be that digital component that you're speaking to engage. That's where kids are going to
Yeah.
read. That's where you're going to find them, and then backing that up with a really positive, fun experience that maybe doesn't look like traditional models of sport.
Absolutely, and I think it comes down to the fact that there is no substitute in my eyes. There is no substitute for playing and participating in sport. You know,
Yeah.
I've got five children ranging from 25 to 7.
Okay.
And I just think sport teaches you so much about life, right? You know, and you know this. It teaches you resilience. It teaches you to lose. It teaches you to win. It teaches you teamwork. All of those things are absolutely crucial in the real world. You know, losing with good grace, having manners, being a good human,
Yeah.
um, being in a team, being physically active, being part of a sport. Frankly, failing. You know, not
Yeah.
being very good at something. Um, Having to accept that other people will always be better than you, but taking the sheer enjoyment of just being in a sport, I think it's so important. Which is why, you know, it's one of the reasons I'm, you know, really passionate. Um, Frankly, just trying to get children off their bums a bit more.
And what, in your experience, what are the most common mistakes that, we'll say, the sports industry is making in trying to get them up and moving and engaging them?
Oh, that is a big question, Claire. Big question. I think some of sport, even though it likes to think it doesn't, still prices out children. You know, I mean, it's very hard. If you're a football fan, it's quite hard and quite expensive to watch football these days. You know, um, it's also quite expensive to go to a sports occasion and a sports event. Now you see lots of people making offers and you know reducing ticket prices and having special days, and the industry is clearly trying. But the facts are, is you know, it can still be quite expensive. Um, and then I guess with some other sports, it's a sense of both facilities and equipment. You know, and
Yeah.
it's not like going for a run. You can kind of put your trainers on and run around the block, or you can kick a football about. And there's a reason that some of the sports that are still the most successful are the ones that have the cheapest points to entry.
Is there a correlation between they are also the ones that maybe are embracing the platforms, whether that's the TikTok or YouTube, to engage with Gen Zs and Gen Alphas? Are they also ones that are moving faster on that and adapting to the needs of these newer generations?
I don't know. I think there are two things that drive sports to really want to adapt and embrace the younger audiences, or sports organisations or clubs.
Okay.
One of them is a bit of this. It's because that they know that they should, and it's why they exist, and it's the right thing to do. The
Right.
other one, frankly, is the black and white numbers of if you're a national governing body, your funding is based on participation. So you'll be doing it. You know, let's face it. If you work for British Cycling or England Rugby, you do it because you love the sport and you want to see the sport grow. You're also doing it because you have to,
Mm.
because participation numbers are doing this, and if participation numbers do that, then your funding does that on the other side. So it's kind of like they need to. You know, it's one is that it's the right thing to do, and some of them will really grasp it because it's not a big money spinner. And what I often see, the people who feel like they have the least heart in growing a new generation of fans in the UK or getting children more active, frankly, are the ones where they're awash with cash. So they
Mm.
don't need to, you know, because
Mm.
they're all about making money. If you are a smaller governing body where it's all about participation, it's all about getting children involved because that you know is it hinges on your funding, then you have to whether you like it or not. So
Mm.
it's sort of it's a double-edged sword, if you like, in a way.
And what do you think can change or move the needle, so that we can have more? Do we need to restructure the model in terms of what incentivizes? I imagine that, like, you will always have a certain element or a pipeline in, but then
Mhm.
there are like a lot of organizations, and even if the sports retailers and brands, like, they all depend on participation as well. But do we need
Yeah.
another incentivization model? How do we balance, like, the value to society versus the commercial viability of it?
Again, you're good with the $64 million questions today, Claire, and I'll do my best. I think there's one single thing that kind of stands out the most for me, and if we can remember a world pre-COVID, before we all went into lockdown and did all of those things, um, the biggest crisis we were certainly facing in the UK, um, in the NHS, was obesity.
Mm.
You know, and inactivity levels are the scariest thing, because inactivity leads to a whole range of health concerns, and that just has impact right across society, and inactivity, in my mind, is sort of one of the most harmful things that we probably face now.
Yeah, massive. It's absolutely huge. And are you seeing that sports brands, sports organizations, are they looking to build, relationships and engage with kids and fans on a social and emotional connection, like to develop, like, I suppose, a relationship with them? Is that kind of the purpose of that initial, you talked about the awareness
Yeah,
piece?
I think it's the only way. I think it's the only way to try and build fandom, to build a sense of community, and you see it with brands, even like take Adidas, who now do like Adidas Originals, and that's not aimed at 6 to 12 year olds, but they're building a brand, a community brand of Adidas Originals. There's a way that, as a bloke in his 40s, I only wear Adidas Gazelle trainers because I've got a lifelong association with them and I absolutely love them. Blah blah blah. That is the gold now. That's the gold that people want, is that you want that association with a brand where you develop a relationship with it. And that is, it starts with awareness, it builds to engagement, and then it becomes inspiration or reward and everything else. And you go, right, okay, I have now got a sense of belonging. And we've all got our own favorite brands and everything else. That's the game that everybody is in now. And I also think it's the same game that sports are in as well.
Mhm.
The difference now is that the choice is so enormous that the reality is, other than huge growth areas like girls football and stuff like that, and even girls rugby, is the reality is everybody's now competing for a smaller piece of the pie, not because of any other reason than that the pie is now cut into 1,000 pieces, whereas before it might have been cut into 20.
Right,
You know,
right,
So
right.
everybody can go and find their own niche, and it's you can, for a marketeer or for somebody who's trying to reach and engage with a specific audience, it's easier to. But going big and broad is really, really hard.
Do you think that can be an accelerant to the industry because it's getting more competitive? Sports brands, everyone in the sports industry ecosystem now needs to work harder, and it's not a given. Do you think that's an accelerant to growth and innovation in our space?
I think it has to be, and you see where people are taking slightly different, whether or not it's almost like relationship opportunities to tie brands alongside other brands. So you think about uh, Man United, who have this association with Adidas, and they're kind of tying in, and they're trying to build in. Think about what they did last year, and again, this is not around Gen Alpha, but bringing out a Stone Roses kind of tracksuit top, which goes, "We are not just Man United and Adidas; we also bloody love Manchester." And last week, we when it was the 30th anniversary of the Definitely Maybe album, Man City bringing out a fourth kit, which was inspired by that album cover. Because
Oh,
what it does there is it's going, look, we're not just a football club. We've got values that wrap us up in our community. And that, just helping to wrap that up is really, really important. Um,
and And that seems to be becoming more important, that representation in sports with the younger audiences. They're more, inclined towards social causes, and inclusion is a huge part,
absolutely.
diversity, gender equality. We're seeing that creep in. So you're saying that, like, sports organizations need to, like, are working harder to reflect values of society?
Absolutely. Because I think one of the things that we do see with children and young people now is that they care far more about the environment and sustainability than, frankly, we did. They're far more aware of mental well-being and physical well-being, far more aware of social justice, diversity and inclusion, all of these things that kind of weren't really talked about. That
Hmm.
if you were staying fit in the 80s, it was because you it was almost by accident because you were playing football or you hockey or whatever it might be. Um, but now, what those kind of topics and things that kids care about, those issues, what that gives sport the opportunity to do is to inject themselves into it. So whether or not it's a collaboration with a creator who might be on a, around a certain specialism or whatever, it means that you can tap into what kids already care about, You can
Okay.
make entertaining content in and around that and go, by the way, sport. You know,
Yes, yes.
that's what
Okay.
that's what Man City have done last week. They've gone, you love Man City and you love Oasis. By the way, here's a third, here's a kit. It's exactly the
Yep.
same thing. It's building that sense of community is really important.
And your approach in with Lucky Socks Media is highlighting the fun aspect and then by the way sport and
Hmm.
helping sports organizations come across as, authentic and, in a way that's not performative and authentic, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of a sequential model really. It's helping them understand how to reach this audience, who the audience are, what they're doing, what are the kind of things that they like, and then helping them effectively inject more fun and entertainment into what they're doing, and whether that's experiential things on a match day or an event, or through the content that they're making,
Okay.
to start building up that engaged relationship with them. Because the Lucky Socks model starts with, is it fun? And then it says, is it right? Well, and this is a real big point, and maybe this is my BBC chip. Is it right? So it's like, is it suitable? Is it appropriate? Is it the right kind of content? Does it encourage like good experiences in the digital and the real world? And then is it
Great.
rewarding? So does it give you something back? Is it participatory, whether again online or in the real world?
Great.
Um, and if you're getting all those things right, then does it inspire you to learn the rules, watch a game, watch the sport, maybe try it? Does it inspire you to become a player or a fan or an athlete? And then the final bit is value. What value does it have back to the organization? Because if you can deliver all of those things, it has a ton of value back to the organization. It changes your brand's reputation. It might have all sorts of, it reflects on how you're seen within that younger audience, and begins to build a brand relationship. And it's just cyclical. It just comes back around again.
Wow. And are there metrics that you use for that value that organizations are using for that value to quantify that?
Not specific ones, other than it's just it's all of those quite blunt tools, I guess. It's like, are you growing reach and engagement? How many children are participating? What is the value back to the company is always the hardest one, frankly. But if you are driving up participation numbers, if you are driving up fandom, if you're driving up eyeballs and people who are just moving, then the value to the organization is clear.
Is clear. And the way we're seeing technologies, emerging technologies like AR, VR, and AI, how are you envisioning that as part of, reaching them in the right way? As you said, we could look at some of the more immersive technologies. Are they going to stay in the digital world? Back to our earlier point. How are you thinking about that in terms of engagement?
I'm watching a lot and playing a lot, and I think what we'll see is that the people who benefit most from AI, for example, will be the people who learn to use it as a tool rather than expect it to do all the hard work for them. And I've seen a great quote that sort of says, "I want AI to help me with my laundry and the dishes. I don't want it to help me with my creative writing." You know, so AI will do loads of things. It will never perfectly recreate creativity. Human creativity will still be a thing. And it might help you. It might help you do some work, and it might do you a bit of donkey in the same way that a dishwasher helps you, right? Um, but I don't think it will ever replace it. And the one thing that we might see around augmented reality with headsets and wearables and all that sort of thing is that it will enjoy the core aspect of it. Will sorry, increase the core aspect of enjoying the sport, but it will never replace it.
Wow. Okay. Very, very cool. And I think that's it. It's that do you think things come in full cycles? Like came from generations of just pure active physical world, blended into technology and almost came full circle towards, very much focused on screens, and that's where we are now. And do you think that it can come like full circle to where kids even today, while they're very adept from, when they're born to zoom on screens, but also to want to come off the screens
Yeah,
more, and that we can find that a kind of a balancing tipping point?
yeah. I think it will as children get older. Once you kind of reach adulthood and everything else. I mean, um, when I was a kid, and I'm sure when you was a kid, Claire, your parents used to say, "Stop watching the TV, or you'll get square eyes." So since the invention of TV in the 50s and the 60s, people have worried about screen time. So that worry about screen time has always been a thing. It's now heightened and magnified because it's just this blooming thing, which is just now a dopamine factory. But I do think it will come. It's never going to go away, but at some stage there might become more of a happy medium. And I don't doubt that in 30 years' time there will be a Claire and a Stu sat talking about the next bit of technology, which is apparently going to ruin everything in the whole world, but in the end kind of doesn't.
Positive story, positive outlook. Well, to wrap up this fantastic conversation, so enjoyable. Looking ahead, what kind of trends do you see maybe dominating youth sports media landscape, sports organizations, maybe in the next 5 years? We won't go too far forward.
Well, it's interesting. I think over the past sort of 3 to 5 years, we've seen the rise of women's sport, which has been, amazing to watch, and now more girls taking part in sport, which is obviously huge. I think what we'll see over the next 3 to 5 years, that's clearly going to continue, right? That's now a juggernaut, as it rightly should be. I think what will happen is that we will see increasingly sports organizations thinking not just about children and participation, but also about families. So I think that children and family space is going to be really, really interesting. Is how do you engage with a 6 to 12-year-old, but also mum, dad, caregiver, whoever it might be, because that's kind of the key to the door. And we talked about participation and money, frankly, and in a family household, about 80% of the family expenditure is dictated to by children. That's the car you drive, the food you eat, the holidays you go on, how you spend your leisure time, the subscriptions you have. For sport, that is a gold mine waiting to be tapped into. And I think that's what we'll see over the next 3 to 5 years. I also hope it is, because it will keep me busy.
Let's go with that. And it's so important. And I think you're absolutely really on the money there in terms of the family engagement, and families are changing. Families are, the dynamics and what that looks like. But bottom line, you're right. The sports industry, in terms of providing the experience and broadening that out for the families, is definitely worth taking note of. Well, I hope we're here in a couple of years' time and we're looking and we're talking about how it's evolved and how you're at the center of it and helping the organizations at that intersection of digital media, sports, youth culture and families as it evolves. Stu, it's been such a pleasure chatting with you. Before we wrap up, is there anything that I maybe haven't asked you about that you'd like to talk about?
No, I think it's just been great to chat and just sort of talk about all of the challenges that the whole of sport faces, really. We've got some exciting things coming up, with some exciting clients. Hopefully 2025 will be a big year for Lucky Self.
Fantastic. I look forward to seeing and hearing more and following the journey and catching up soon. Thanks so much for your time, Stu.
Thank you. Cheers.